And it's all yours, Lloyd.
Okay. Well, we took a little different turn last night when I was putting some final touches on what we were supposed to talk about tonight, which was Baby and Bobby. I began to realize two things. One, the slides were getting rather long, and the slides were beginning to kind of creep over into what we're supposed to talk about next month, which is Pontiac. So what I did was kind of change directions a little bit, looking at kind of the time frame of everything that we've been talking about, keeping everything pretty much linear. I also noticed that we, because of jumping to Baby and Bobby, we're skipping over a significant part of history that shaped the dynamics of what we talk about next month, and that is Pontiac. So last night about 9 o'clock, I sat down and completely redid the slides, and hopefully there's no typos in this. What I put together was pretty quick, but I think it's going to touch base on some things that will fill in some gaps before we actually get to next month. And tonight we're going to talk about Monongahela. And since yesterday was Memorial Day, we're going to just subtitle this as a memorial, because we'll see here in a little bit that the Monongahela actually had quite a bit of a mark in history where there were a number of individuals killed in a battle. So let's just jump in here, take a look at our objectives. And we're going to first take a look at some playground bullies. Then we're going to look at an alliance, a massacre, and then the aftermath of that massacre that took place. And what we're talking about tonight actually takes place within a very short period of time. From the time that Nicholas died in the spring of 1750 to where we will end up at the end of the slides. And this is going to be a little bit shorter tonight than what we've done before. It's going to be only about a 5 to 7 year span of time from the point of where we left off last month. So Nicholas died in 1750. Before and after his death, the Wyandotte tribe began sending signs of allegiance to the English cause. We talked about that last month, how before that, the Huron tribe had reiterated loyalties time and time again to the French while they were at the Fort Detroit. Because the Wyandotte under Nicholas began to move more and more toward the English, this infuriated the French. And with the French infuriated, it only brazened the band that Nicholas had left Detroit with to become closer and closer with the English. They weren't going to be told what they could or couldn't do on their own accord. So the Wyandotte in the area of Sandusky began to form a very tight, very loyal relationship with the English, and also with the Iroquois Confederacy. At this same time, there were some pretty clear differences in both the political alliances. Detroit was French, Sandusky was leaning English, and also religious philosophies began to infiltrate the tribe that showed some clear divisions between Detroit and Sandusky. By the mid-1750s, there were some notable differences, but still the Huron and the Wyandotte remained united as a distinct people. They did not split. They acknowledged their differences of opinions on a lot of things, and they just agreed to disagree. They remained both Huron, and from this point onward, they also remain Wyandotte. And this is why it's very important that we look at who we are as a people as both Huron Wyandotte. But unfortunately, if you start looking for Huron Wyandotte anywhere in the history books, it doesn't exist. If we don't begin to recognize ourselves as both Huron and Wyandotte, then people that come up after us will lose a significant chunk of history when they just look for Wyandotte and don't recognize the fact that we're also Huron. The English the English began
Go eat right
to
now. Go eat.
the English began to employ some tactics that were not being well received by many of the different nations. They began to employ some tactics of intimidation, and they also began to employ some brute force that was basically killing some of the tribes off. The English colonists, when necessary, they had no problems killing the Indians. All they wanted was the land, and they didn't care about the people. They didn't care about the culture. They didn't care about the established traditions. They wanted land, land, land. That's all they were interested in obtaining. The English, as we know, established 13 colonies, and each one of those colonies had different policies regarding the way in which they interacted with the various tribes. Their policies fluctuated because the different colonies were spread from north to south, and there were different nations that they interacted with that required different ways of dealing with the peoples. And each of the colonies were founded upon many different principles. The English believed basically that the Indians were nothing but a bunch of barbarians and savages, and because of that, they didn't have to treat them respectfully and in a humane way. And the English began to employ some very brutal tactics against the tribes. And Francis Parkman kind of summed up a little bit of what was actually going on between the British colonies. And he said the differences among them were great, referencing the 13 colonies. Some were purely English, others were made up of various races, though the Anglo-Saxon was almost always predominant. Some had one prevailing religious creed, others had many creeds, some had charters, and some had not. So the English colonies were not necessarily unified together from north to south in their stance in the North American continent, and especially in the way that they interacted with the different tribes. They all took a different view. In contrast, the French, unlike the British, they claimed just a little swath of land on the eastern coast. The French claimed a vast amount of land in North America, all the way east to west from the Allegheny to the Rocky Mountains, and from south to north from Spanish Florida all the way up to Hudson Bay. The English had a little portion around the Hudson Bay, but outside that, the French claimed a significant part of the North American continent. Importantly enough, the French controlled all the major waterways, so they could move without any hindrances. They had made contact with many different nations. They traded. They actually had established themselves fairly well. And one of their primary goals that we talked about a couple of months ago was to convert all the Indians to Catholicism. And when that happened, they were all indoctrinated into French culture as citizens. Didn't matter if you were Wyandotte, didn't matter if you were Huron, Potawatomi, whatever nation you were, you instantly became a citizen of the crown. The French also didn't feel the need to take the land because it was already theirs, and they encouraged addictions to their goods that they were sending up and down the coast and north to south, east and west. They felt the philosophy of getting the Indians to be committed to them through their vices was the best way to control the Indians. The French, unfortunately, even though they wanted to have all the different tribes dependent upon them for their stuff, they could not compete with the cheap English junk that was coming across the Great Water. The English just saturated North America with their cheap stuff with the intent of pulling away the tribes over to their cause. The French basically couldn't compete. The English trade goods flooded the markets. The English took advantage of what the Indians were addicted to, and they supplied it cheaper than what the French could, and in vast amounts, far beyond what the French could ship across the Atlantic Ocean. But unfortunately, that just lasted for a while. Where the French could not compete with English presence and trade, the effect of force and numbers could intimidate the Indian ally to the English and eventually bring them to the French side. So where the English had initially began to swoo most of the nations over to their side of this looming difference of opinions, they began to lose the tribes because the English were just a little too rough. The trade goods, the dependency that they had upon all these different materials didn't balance out because the English were just too disrespectful of the tribes. The Lakes Confederacy remained intact after the Treaty of 1701, the Peace of Montreal. The Huron-Wyandotte, the Ottawa, the Potawatomi, and the Chippewa remained very close in their political and military alliance. Whereas the Iroquois Confederacy basically did as they said that they would in the treaty, they honored their neutrality. The Seneca, Cayuga, Oneida, Onondaga, Mohawk, and the Tuscarora basically were setting up in upstate New York, just kind of watching everything play out and not really getting involved politically with what was happening. But in a way they were just doing it very stealthy and very quietly. They weren't messing with the French. Come to find out, they started messing with the different tribes. The Iroquois committed some atrocities against the other nations. In particular, the Delaware. The Iroquois were very rough on the Delaware, which caused them to begin to commit their alliances toward the Lakes Confederacy. Likewise, the Shawnee felt the injustice of the English, and they also felt the sting of Iroquois treachery, and they also began to align themselves very tightly with the Lakes Confederacy. The Huron of Lorette had been very quiet for almost 100 years. They stayed up in Quebec. They kept to themselves. They ventured out. They did a lot of things politically, but they never really got involved militarily. But now they were beginning to show signs of venturing from Quebec, and they aligned themselves alongside the cousins, us, the Huron-Wyandotte. Basically, all the tribes, with the exception of the Iroquois, began to side with the French and the Lakes Confederacy because the English were just too brutal in their relationship with the different tribes. The tribes chose the lesser of two evils. They decided to go with the French. The only ones that did not side with the French, and there were a few other exceptions, but the primary ones were the Iroquois Confederacy. But they still remained neutral, and they did not bear arms with the English against the French and against the tribes. The French respected the tribes more than the English, and the land that the French claimed was so vast, it covered so much acreage throughout North America that they could not inhabit the land like was being done by the English on the coast. So the different tribes were not as threatened by the French as what they were now with the English. And the Ohio country became the target. It became nuclear zone number one for what was about to happen. And the English began to push deeper and deeper into the Ohio country, which was claimed by the French. And it became the testing ground to see just how far they could go before the French would step up and say, enough's enough. Ultimately, come to find out, it was the Iroquois Confederacy and what they were doing among the various tribes that sparked the new war that took place in North America. The Iroquois were very good in their diplomacy, and they hid the fact of what they were doing for quite a while. But when the Iroquois lashed out against the Delaware and the Shawnee, it was the Huron-Wyandotte that recognized what the Iroquois were doing and began to share with the other nations their policies and their alliance with England, and how that alliance was causing great harm to the different nations. It was the Albany Congress in 1754 from June 19th to July 11th, where the English colonies tried to unite their different variations in philosophies and traditions and policies toward the Indians into a single unified cause against the French. Unfortunately, they couldn't come to enough agreement to unite together to fight as one with this impending battle that was about to happen. They were still too diversely unique in their ways that they approached everything. The Albany Congress also wanted to try and get the Mohawk to basically stop messing with the colony of New York. The Mohawk were just unsettled. They were restless. They caused a lot of problems. And because of that, they wanted to reinforce the neutrality of the Iroquois Confederacy in whole, hoping that they could control the Mohawk, and also to get, again, a support of neutrality. Unfortunately, the nations of the Iroquois Confederacy basically said, nah, we ain't gonna do that. Everybody can make the choice to do what they want. So the Mohawk continued to be a problem for the colony of New York and some of the others. The Oneida, Tuscarora, Mohawk gave the English land that did not belong to them during the Albany Congress. They gave away land that belonged to the Delaware. They gave away land that belonged to the Shawnee and a couple of other nations. And because of that, the Wyandotte Valley in Pennsylvania was open to settlement. And over the course of the next several years, there were several battles that took place there, which caused a lot of loss of life between the colonists, the European colonists, as well as the nations. And the Delaware and the Shawnee were the ones that primarily felt the wrath of the English whenever they retaliated. The alliance against the Iroquois Confederacy was getting stronger and stronger and stronger. Oddly enough, back in 1701, this Great Peace of Montreal was supposed to cease all of this battling and bickering and fighting back and forth between the different tribes in the Iroquois Confederacy, but it didn't quite stand. The only thing that the 1701 Peace of Montreal did was keep the Confederacy from fighting against the French that were in New France. Then, here's the big thing that happened. In 1754, on May 28th, Lieutenant Colonel George Washington ambushed and killed a French commanding officer by the name of Jumonville. This was out in the middle of nowhere in the colony of Pennsylvania, way out to the west. And it was almost such a remote occurrence that nobody should have known about it. Washington killed a couple of other French soldiers that were there with Jumonville, but unfortunately, it made its way back out. And the incident happened in the general area of the Monongahela and the Allegheny Rivers, which would become the beehive of what was about to erupt. Once this leaked out, the French vowed revenge. They were going to basically show the English that they had no business being in North America. They were going to drive the English away from North America like the English did the Dutch, and they vowed that they would take revenge for the loss of Jumonville. In July of 1754, the French built Fort Duquesne right at the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers. This site had initially been established as a trading post by the English. So the French made an effort to start pushing the English out. After that happened, there was this chess game between the French and the English, and the big bullies that they become basically pinned the tribes between themselves, and they became expendable pawns in this European conflict that had begun to erupt in North America. On January 15th, 1755, General Edward Braddock set sail for the American colonies. He was dispatched by the king to take care of the problem. So he brought his standing army with him. He was going to go directly into confrontation with the French and put it down quickly. When he arrived in Virginia in March, he immediately began to hack his way through the wilderness toward Fort Duquesne. And at that time, the French called upon their Indian allies. The greatest number of warriors that came to the call of the French were the Ottawa, the Potawatomi, the Chippewa, Huron, Wyandotte, Delaware, Shawnee, and the Mingo. There were other nations that came at the calling of the French, but these nations sent the most warriors. They were being led as the commander, a Frenchman by the name of Captain Daniel. I'm not going to mention the two next names there, but Beaujeu. He became the commander of the French and the Indian army that was basically put in place to protect Fort Duquesne. Captain Beaujeu abandoned European tactics of war. donned war paint and the clothing of his Indians, or lack thereof, and planned his attack. Reluctant to attack and fight a much superior army, the Indians had their morale boosted and their resolve to fight strengthened as Beaujeu became one in a figurative and literal sense with his troops. So what Beaujeu did was completely change the philosophy of how European war was going to be fought in North America, and he adopted the tactics of the Indians. And whenever he employed these tactics, it was a total change from the way in which the Europeans would fight war in North America. On the early morning of July 9th, 1755, Captain Beaujeu prepared his ambush. General Braddock had over 1,300 troops, and along with those troops, he had a number of supporting men and women, along with tons of supplies and equipment, because he came prepared to stay in the wilderness of Western Pennsylvania for a long time. So he had tons and tons of material that was being carried by wagons, which that slowed him down. Captain Beaujeu had 637 Indians of the different nations. He had 36 French officers and cadets, 72 regular French soldiers, and 146 Canadians. So he had an army that was numerically inferior to what Braddock had. Unfortunately for Beaujeu, on the opening volleys of the attack, he got shot and killed. When he got shot and killed, all of the Canadian militia basically turned tail and ran. They abandoned the battlefield to the Indians. But the Indians did not abandon the battlefield. They stood, they fought, and they basically annihilated the British. Their awful war whoop rang out on the mountainside. The fierce, savage growl of the bear came from the Ottawa, mingled with the blood-curdling screech of the Winnebago, imitating the panther of Wisconsin, mingled with the venomous cries of the Menominee, the treacherous screams of the Potawatomi, and the long wail of revenge from the Wyandottes. So does anybody know, I've mentioned it a time or two, I think, over the last several months, does anybody know what the war cry of our grandfathers was?
The Raven.
The screech of the raven. That was our war cry. And the long wail of revenge from the Wyandottes, along with the screams and the curdling screeches from the other nations, just basically permeated this wilderness in Western Pennsylvania. And it would have been an absolutely terrifying moment for the British English that was standing there fighting. In 3 hours or less, the battle had been won by the various tribes. General Braddock died 3 days later from a wound to his chest. The British and colonial militia lost 27 officers killed, 37 were wounded. They had 430 soldiers killed, 385 were wounded. The French and the Indians lost fewer than 30 men killed, and there was an unknown number that were wounded. That was an absolute devastating loss. It was a massacre of monumental proportions that took place in North America. There had never been anything like this happened over the last 100 years as the French and the English began to spar, especially over the last 50 years. So this was an absolute devastating setback for the English, the British in North America. At this time, it's believed that a young Huron-Wyandotte warrior participated in the Battle of the Monongahela. In time, this young warrior would rise to obtain great fame. He would become very well known throughout all the Indian world. Does anybody know what this young man's name was participating in the battle? Basically, as a child.
Tarhay.
Tarhay, yes. It is believed that Tarhay basically took the battle for the very first time at the Battle of the Monongahela. He survived, and he would, as we all are very much aware, he would grow into one of the most profound, one of the most solid, one of the most honored, one of the most respected chiefs that we've ever had. And about what age, does everybody remember about what age a young boy as a Huron Wyandotte warrior could fight? And this would be about the age that people believe that Tarhay would have been when he took the battle against the English. About what age could he have been?
I'm thinking 12.
Anywhere from 10, anywhere from 10 to 12 years old. So he was a child. It's believed that whenever he took to the fight, he was just barely big enough, if he had a rifle, to lift a rifle and fire it against the British. And it was during this battle, at the end, when they were going in and picking up all the spoils of the war, that most of our warriors got for themselves for the very first time a rifle. And it's also at the Battle of the Monongahela that we obtained our first horses. We got many horses from the British, the English, and we basically, for the first time, had horses to ride. Up until then, we basically traversed the whole of the North American continent on foot. So there was a lot of spoils that took place. And from that, the French and their Indian allies, aware of their strategic advantage, began ravaging exposed outlying settlements. So after the battle had been won, the aftermath was grim for the English. The colonies were basically at the mercy of the French and their allies as they basically walked up and down the coast, striking the colonies at free will. When Braddock and his army was destroyed, there was not a standing army left in North America that could stand toe-to-toe with the French and the allies. All they had was the militia, and they were unorganized. And as we have talked about a couple of times tonight, the different colonies could not find a way to unite themselves long enough to stand and defend themselves as one colony against the French and the Indians. So the aftermath also brought in the French and the Indian War. And we will see next month, after the closure of the French and Indian War, which we're not going to take the time to actually talk about that. There's just too much there that we don't really want to spend the time on. But the aftermath of the French and Indian War led to Pontiac. And next month, we're going to talk about Pontiac, Baby and Bobby, and what happened there, to get an idea of how the French and the Indian War basically allowed somebody like Pontiac to end up doing what he did, which was phenomenal. So as usual, there are some sources for everybody to take the time to read from cover to cover. And that was a little bit of a different change from what we've done the last couple of months, but it tied in a good portion of what we're going to be talking about next month without making it about an hour and 15 minutes long. So this one actually was one of the shortest that we've done in a while, which kind of nice little break for everybody. So any questions? Okay, good. Any comments?
I'm wondering, what is mono, what the title, what does that word mean?
Monongahela?
Yes, thank you.
I don't know exactly what the name means, but the Monongahela and the Allegheny are the two rivers that come together in western Pennsylvania that basically form the Ohio River. I have read in the past what the Monongahela actually means in the language of the nation that it was named after, but right now I just can't recall what it means, what the actual translation of the name means.
Okay, but it's the battle of the word that we don't know what it means because of the location.
Well, the Monongahela is a river. How it obtained the name Monongahela, I don't know. but it is in western Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I got that.
Yeah.
You said the battles where I'm sorry, say it again.
Monongahela.
Monongahela and the Allegheny come together in Pennsylvania.
Correct. So the Battle of the Monongahela was a devastating defeat for the English, the British, and it took place just right at almost at the confluence of the Monongahela and Allegheny.
I see. So where the Monongahela is dumping into the Allegheny.
Where, yeah, the Monongahela dumps into the Ohio River. Where the Monongahela and Allegheny come together, forms the Ohio River, which today is Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Okay, interesting.
And back
I
then,
remember right, Monongahela means the river of the falling banks.
The river of the fallen banks.
Falling banks, it had like really high banks on it, and the sides, the banks fell into the river.
Okay, so high like there, what's that? Where
They're really
Lloyd took
tall
me
and a
with the
lot of
truck.
dirt.
They're
And
like the water's here, the banks are like this, but they've fallen in.
yeah, because as the river washes past them, it falls in.
Because it's not a strong geological feature, it's something soft.
yeah, remember
Right.
remember at the gathering when we went out and we
Yeah,
looked at
it was, yes,
the Neosho?
yes.
As we set up on the bridge, you could see the bluff on the other side that was
Yeah.
rock, and then the other area down where it was a lot flatter had those tall banks, and that's basically what the Monongahela would have been, tall banks of just mud, of dirt.
Okay, that was interesting and useful. Thank you.
Any more comments, thoughts?
It's interesting that we're talking about this because I had just posted personally about how Wyandotte's have always been near waterways, like major waterways, wherever we've been. So like the Sandusky River, but Monongahela would have been one as well, which I really didn't know much about it. But it's kind of in a very broad historical sense that I talk with the interns whenever they come. It's just kind of to have a broad sense of history that we first sided with the French, and then kind of once we left Detroit, we started siding with the English, and then at Battle of Fallen Timbers, whenever they turned their back on us at Fort Miami, that we then we signed the Treaty of Greenville. We sided with the Americans. So in every instance, we kept our word what we were going to do, and then they kind of turned their backs on us every single time. But we didn't let that deter what we said we would do.
Yeah. Honor was first and foremost part of our diplomacy. When we committed, even if it brought a price of detriment to us. We never went back on our word. We honored what we said. And it's interesting that you said that, because initially we sided with the French against the English because we considered the English to be the worst of the two choices. The French were the best. And then after the French and Indian War and the Revolutionary War came about, we ended up siding with the British against the colonial Americans. So it's interesting how our grandmas and grandpas chose the lesser of two evils at that time to be the British and not their colonials, their people. So it's interesting how we initially fought the English because they were the worst, and then we ended up siding with the English because they were the best choice at the time.
Yeah.
So interesting how politics were back then.
Yeah.
So next month we talk about.
Monongahela is one of the. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Chris.
The Monongahela is one of the rivers we used to go up and set up the winter hunting camps on, and then
Yeah.
tributaries that ran into the Monongahela.
Well, it could actually be that back before the dispersal, when the Wanneroo were in that part of western Pennsylvania and in upstate New York along the Niagara, the traditional land that the Wanneroo basically claimed could have gone down into that area where the Monongahela was. So that is not a new part of the country that we were unfamiliar with, because we'd been in and out of that part of Pennsylvania for untold centuries. And it was easy for us to actually go in there and traverse and move around because it was hunting grounds, it was homeland, it was a very important part of the North American continent for us. That's why when Nicholas basically started moving to the east, he initially settled in that area before the Iroquois drove him out. So as Chris noted, it was a very, very, very important place for us, and it had been for untold centuries.
I found it on the map. So I see the two rivers, once they meet, then they call it the Ohio.
Correct.
And this is my Western bias, but I think that means they're flowing east to west. I expected them to flow. Is that right? Sorry, everything here goes one direction.
They're flowing kind of the Monongahela and the Allegheny kind of flow from north to east, or from the north to the east, and from the east, or sorry, from the north to the west, and from the east to the west. And then the Ohio flows from the east to the west into the Mississippi.
Okay. Thank you.
Because at that point, they would be on what would be the western side of the Appalachian Mountains.
Okay. Turns out my geography is terrible. Thank you.
And then, of course, we know how important the Ohio River was for us. It was basically the whole of the Ohio River was the defining boundary of what we claimed as our land. All the way from Pennsylvania to Indiana. When the Delaware basically got ran out of Pennsylvania and the Shawnee were just right behind them, they also got ran out about the same time that the Delaware did. It was our grandmas and grandpas that gave the Delaware and the Shawnee the land that they basically resided on in Ohio. A lot of people think that we came in and the Shawnee were already there and the Delaware were already there and they gave us the land. That is a major, major flaw in some histories that you will read. It was the Wyandotte, the Huron Wyandotte, that gave the Delaware and the Shawnee land in Ohio to live upon. That's why in 1843, the Delaware returned the favor. And they gave us, actually at a pretty steep price, they gave us some land in Indian Territory that we called home as a return of the favor for what we did with them when they were homeless, and then we found ourselves homeless after the 42 treaty. So one of our best friends ever has always been the Delaware people. Any more questions, comments? If not, I think we're probably pretty done. And next month, talk a little bit about some topics that gets a little difficult for us to acknowledge from time to time. Just to give you a little bit of a insight of some of what we will talk about to get your minds to thinking a little bit in that direction, is something that's not new to us as a people. The time frame after what we just started talking about tonight becomes a little difficult for the Huron in Detroit and the Wyandotte in Sandusky to deal with. So we're going to see some division. We've already talked about a little division that took place in the tribe at this time when Nicholas left Detroit, but we're going to see that that division gets a little bit sharper, and the sword between the Wyandottes in Sandusky and the Wyandottes in Detroit becomes a little tenuous. So we'll talk about that next week and kind of break it down and see why it happened and what happened afterwards. So if we don't have any more thoughts or questions, I think we're done, Kim.
All right, I'll stop the recording.